Hey folks, Mr. Howard here. Just a quick introduction to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the book that we're going to be reading um, starting this class. So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was written around the same time that the Canterbury Tales was, in the 1400s. We know from the accent, remember that when people wrote before there was standardized spelling, they wrote the way they pronounced things. And so just like Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was written with an accent, and the accent places the work on the border of Wales. So it was written like out in the country, which I think is going to be important. And we're doing this one first because it has a lot of similarities to Beowulf in a way that the Canterbury Tales does not. The Canterbury Tales was written at the same time, but it was written in London, and London had a lot more of that Norman French influence. It's just like today, like we have this pop culture, we have things that are considered cool, and those things generally start in the cities, and they slowly work their way out into the country, and so the country is generally, from the standards of city folks, considered to be like backwards or old-fashioned or quaint or whatever words they want to apply to it. But the people in the country don't feel that way. They're certainly happy with the ways that they have, and they take on new things. They just take it on at a slower pace than in places that are cultural centers and things like that. And so while London was much more advanced, for example, in its use of poetry and some of its themes and its connection to William the Conqueror and the Norman French, the country was in a slower state of transition. And so we're going to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight first. It was written out there in the country on the border of Wales, northern border of Wales and England. So let's talk first about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's a medieval romance. It has a romantic hero. The romantic hero is this guy here, Sir Gawain. He's a knight. He is the nephew of King Arthur, and so he's of high social status. He follows the code of chivalry. In fact, he's a great example of chivalry. And, when we, when we read and understand about him, we're going to see that in his decision-making, chivalry is front and center throughout the entire story. So he's going to be a medieval hero, and he's going to undergo a test of love, in this case, forbidden love. He's going to fall in love with a lady who is married to a guy that, is his host in a castle, and he's going to have to struggle against that as things go on. But in terms of similarities to Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight has an anonymous author. We don't know who the author was. There's no name associated with it. So again, it comes from that old storytelling tradition where authors aren't necessarily labeled on things. With Chaucer, we actually know who the author was. He was very big on putting his name on something so that he could make himself immortal and last beyond his days. That goes back to that ancient Greek tradition that goes back to Homer and comes up from Southern Europe into England. And so you can see that this author is more influenced by the storytelling tradition of the Anglo-Saxons, which stories belong to everybody. They weren't any individual person's domain or under their control. It was written by a priest, so it came from a monastery. I should say the Pearl poet here. I forgot the L. We don't know who the priest is, but he wrote some other things, most notably a poem called The Pearl, which is an allegory about the value of somebody. A pearl is a valuable piece of jewelry, and in this allegorical poem, the pearl is compared to a person's soul. And actually, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there's an analogy that compares Sir Gawain to a pearl, and we'll look for that and we'll talk about that. I'm not going to make you read the pearl, but it's been analyzed by computers, and it's clear that it was written by the same person using the same accent and the same word choice and diction and stuff like that. And so this person has written other things, and we can compare and contrast Sir Gawain and the Green Knight with those other things, as opposed to Beowulf, which we don't necessarily have. But it was written by a priest, just like Beowulf was. It's written in alliterative verse, mostly. You can tell that even from the opening lines. Let me read you the opening lines of this story and just listen to the alliteration. Once the siege and assault had done for Troy, and the city was smashed, burned to ash, the traitor whose tricks had taken Troy for the Greeks, Aeneas the noble, was exiled for Achilles' death, for concealing his killer, and he and his tribe made themselves lords. Can you hear it? It's written in alliterative verse throughout. So just like Beowulf, it's got that storytelling technique of the Anglo-Saxons where words repeat their beginning sounds. Also, like Beowulf, this is structured in parts. This is more structured than Beowulf. It's going to say part 1, and then you'll read part 1, part 2, and then you'll read part 2. But Beowulf is essentially in parts, right? You got the battle with Grendel, you got the battle with Grendel's mom, and you've got the dragon. And these 3 parts are distinct and progressive. And the same thing is true with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So it's sort of a prequel, if you will, or a precursor to chapters and how it is. Generally speaking, though, the reason that things that sort of come from oral tradition are structured in parts is because you have different nights of the storytelling. So the Grendel story would be the first night. The Grendel's mom story would be the second night. And the dragon story would be the third night. It would be a 3-night story. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is written. It's still got that feel of the narrator. The narrator's voice is very clear in it, and it's meant to be told over a period of 4 consecutive nights very clearly, and so it's split up that way. So it's structured in parts. You're going to see some themes from Beowulf show up in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight because they haven't entirely disappeared from the psyche of the storyteller or the people he's telling the story to. The first is civilization versus nature. The Green Knight is going to be symbolic of nature in a lot of ways, and we'll talk about that when the story comes up. But he's green, like green is the color of plants and leaves and, like all of that kind of stuff. So there's definitely a connection to nature, right there in the title. And Sir Gawain is a representative of civilization, and it's him versus the Green Knight. And so civilization versus nature is very present in this story. And throughout the entire story, you'll find that, aside from himself and his own internal conflict, Sir Gawain's greatest conflicts are with nature. We're also going to see elements of Christianity versus paganism. The Green Knight is going to be reminiscent of Anglo-Saxon times, of Anglo-Saxon traditions, of old pagan ways of thought and doing things, and he's going to be associated with magic that's not Christian in origin, whereas Sir Gawain comes from King Arthur's court, and he is a representative of Christianity, and he keeps his Christianity very close to his heart. He has a picture of the Virgin Mary on the inside of his shield, and he's always saying, by God, or by Mary, or, like these kinds of things. His speech is infused with Christian language, and so you end up with this Christianity versus paganism thing, where Sir Gawain is the representative of Christianity and tries to teach readers how to act in a Christian way. Just like Beowulf, the story is allegorical. And just like Beowulf, the story is going to teach young people how to live their lives and how to be better human beings. And so you got to look for the allegories. You got to look for the connections and the lessons that are tied in here and are tied to Christian values and ideas. And then again, just like Beowulf, this is going to include monsters and magic and, like all of those sorts of elements that you would come to expect from the old stories. So there are similarities in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to Beowulf, and you should be aware of them and look for them. But it represents a transition, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Whoops, I skipped a slide here. Because you see elements of more modern English poems and stories in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight that weren't present in the old one. So it's a nice transition piece to take us from the old way of telling stories, which is Beowulf, to the new way, which is the Canterbury Tales. And this sort of represents a middle ground, like I said, because it's from a rural setting where it still feels those old Anglo-Saxon elements more than somebody in the big city does. So it includes rhyme, the quatrains called Bob and Wheels that we talked about. They show up in here. So it's not straight alliterative verse. It's got elements of rhyme in it, making it modern and different and calling to that Southern tradition. It includes romance, as opposed to Beowulf, which was just about this warrior who was killing things. This one is going to have a romantic love interest in it. And so, that's very French. The French are famous for romance, and chivalry is infused with the relationship between a man and a woman. And we even have the term chivalry in some way refer to that. When you talk about being chivalrous and sort of like, not going back to the old definition, but how it's used in the modern language, it's about like opening doors for women and walking on the right side of the road and saying please and thank you. And, people say things like chivalry is dead to lament the fact that men don't treat women very well anymore. And that's definitely part of this. So we've got this romance element going on. Another thing that's really different about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight from Beowulf is that this one's focused on the trial of self. Sir Gawain's greatest enemy on some level is actually himself, his internal fears and doubts and desires, which are not living up to his ideal. And so he's got this internal struggle. Beowulf never had an internal struggle. Beowulf started the story freaking awesome and died freaking awesome. He had no character development. He was the same person throughout. Sir Gawain is going to struggle. He's going to struggle with himself. He's going to struggle internally. He's flawed. So this trial of self comes out. And we'll look at that, and that's very different. That's something that the people in the Middle Ages were working on that the people in the Anglo-Saxon times didn't. They wanted their heroes to be perfect. And the Middle Ages people want their heroes to be growing, and that's a difference. The central theme of this is chivalry. We have some of those Anglo-Saxon themes, but they're not the central theme. When it all comes down to it, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a story of chivalry and trying to live up to the chivalric code. And so that's a difference. Finally, like I said, the protagonist is flawed. He's not perfect. And his flaws actually make him, I think, more relatable. I think he's more likable than Beowulf in a lot of ways. And we'll see that as we read the story as well. So there are some key differences that you want to pay attention to as we read forward. Lastly, and this is the final thing I want to talk about in this lecture, is that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a King Arthur story. It's part of Arthurian legend. Like I said, Sir Gawain is actually King Arthur's nephew. I guess nephew is kind of a fancy word for it. So he's the son of one of King Arthur's half-sisters. He has a bunch of half-sisters, and one of them gave birth to Gawain. Gawain has a number of brothers, Gareth and Gaheris, and Mordred. And so we'll talk about that. But in order to understand the place of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in Arthurian legend, you have to sort of have a foundational understanding of Arthurian legend and the King Arthur stories. A good place to start would be watching Disney's Sword in the Stone. That's sort of a classic. If you have Disney Plus and you want to go in and watch that, please do. It's an enjoyable thing to watch. But I'm going to tell it to you. If you're really familiar with Arthurian legend, you can sort of shut down the video right now. Unless you enjoy hearing my retelling. But if you're not, please watch because you need to know this background to understand what's going on. So Arthurian legend, the story of King Arthur. So King Arthur's a famous British king. He's the legend of the Sleeping King, actually. He's dead, but not really. Like, when he died, he was taken to Avalon by three women who probably represent the three fates. And theoretically, when England needs him, he's going to come back and sort of reassert his dominance. The Sleeping King legend is very, very typical in a lot of European nations. Lots of them have ideas of sleeping kings, but King Arthur's probably the most famous of them. So Arthur was probably a real person. The thought is that his name was probably Arturius, and he was a Roman, post-Roman soldier who was leading the British against the Anglo-Saxon invaders around 450, and probably had cavalry, and this is where the story of the knights come from. There's lots of theories about this, and you can go and look at it. But the Arthurian legend is a series of stories that are sort of paradoxical in the way that they're set up. All of the characters and all of the equipment and all of the way people act in Arthurian legend is like high medieval people. It's like they're equipped as people living in 1400, but the stories take place a long time in the past, like 500 AD, even before the Anglo-Saxons were like really established. And so it's sort of this weird paradox where they behave in a way that people back then couldn't possibly have behaved, and they are equipped with equipment that people back then couldn't possibly have. It would be like if we retold the story of I don't know, George Washington crossing the Delaware, and we gave him modern military equipment. I mean, that's sort of the equivalent of what's going on here, and knowledge of all modern events. It's just sort of the way King Arthur stories are. But the story begins with King Arthur's father. His name was Uther, and he was trying to become king of England by conquering all of the various enemies. And he was trying to conquer a place called Cornwall. And he was conquering, an earl, another nobleman's land, but he fell in love with the earl's wife. He looked at her and fell in love with her at first sight. But she was happily married to this earl, and Arthur wanted to get with her. So Arthur had this advisor, this wizard advisor named Merlin, who you probably heard of. Not Arthur, Uther, his dad, had this advisor Merlin. And he came up with this plan with Merlin to get with this woman. I think her name was Igraine. And so Merlin basically cast a spell on Uther that made Uther look exactly like Igraine's husband. And then he snuck into the castle and got with her. And that's how Arthur was born. Uther eventually dies, and his sort of attempt to unite England falls apart. And Merlin takes this baby and gives him to this guy named Kay. Ector, Kay's father to raise, and so he's raised in this household with a young knight, as a foster kid. He doesn't really know who his parents are, and he spends his youth learning to be a squire and a knight with this guy Sir Ector, and Sir Ector's real son is a guy named Kay, who doesn't treat Arthur very well. And so the story goes that when he's still young, when he's still too young to be a knight officially, there's a giant tournament in London, and Sir Ector goes, and he brings his son Kay with him, and Arthur is supposed to act as Kay's squire. And so years ago, Merlin had created this stone that had a sword stuck in it, and the sword couldn't be pulled out of the stone. And inscribed on the stone was something that said, "He who shall pull forth this sword from the stone shall become king of England." And so every knight and every lord in the land came and tried to pull the sword from the stone. It couldn't happen, and they all gave up on it. And the sword and stone were sitting in a courtyard of a chapel in England, in London, and had just been sort of forgotten and overgrown with weeds and whatnot. Anyway, King Arthur, who was just Arthur the Squire at that point, accidentally forgot to bring Sir Kay's sword to the tournament, and so Sir Kay was going to have to fight without a sword. And so he ran back to the inn to get the sword, but the inn was all locked up because everybody at the inn had gone to the tournament. And so Arthur was desperately trying to find a sword for Sir Kay to use in the tournament, and he saw one sticking out of a stone in this disused courtyard, and he runs in there and he pulls the sword out of the stone, and then he takes it to Kay, and he goes to give it to Kay, and Sir Ector is like, "Wait a minute, what sword is that?" Right? And he takes the sword, and he's like, "Oh my God, it's a sword in the stone!" And they realize that Arthur pulled this sword out of the stone, and so therefore is destined to be king of England. But of course, not everybody accepts him because he's this young kid, and nobody really knows of his noble birth, and all of this kind of stuff. And so Arthur sets about uniting England, and he fights a number of battles against people who don't accept his kingship. And a series of episodes happen to him. The sword in the stone is actually not Excalibur. Everybody thinks about this great sword that King Arthur had called Excalibur. This was given to him by some water serpent named the serpent's not the right word. A water fairy or something named the Lady of the Lake. She gave him this magical sword called Excalibur that can cut through anything and is absolutely devastatingly powerful. It also came with a scabbard, and when he wore it, he couldn't be killed, which is super awesome as well. So he ends up being this epic hero sort of a guy, and he fights all these battles. He creates this table, this round table. It's important that it's a round table because there's no head and foot. So everybody at the round table is sort of equal. So he creates this round table and gets a bunch of knights, makes them the knights of the round table. He recruits the greatest warriors in the land, and they join him. Chief among his great warriors are Lancelot, Gawain, Galahad, and Mordred. These are the ones that you hear about. We'll talk about them in a second. Lancelot is his best fighter. Lancelot comes from France, a place called Benwick. And Lancelot is really the epic hero of all epic heroes of King Arthur's court, the best swordsman and lance fighter. I don't know. horsemen in England at the time. He could defeat anybody in combat, and when he and Arthur are united, they're essentially invincible. One of the stories is King Arthur is going to marry this woman named Guinevere, who's the most beautiful woman in all of England. And she's supposed to be coming to the wedding when she gets captured by some bad knights. And Lancelot actually goes and rescues her for the king. Unfortunately, Lancelot falls in love with Guinevere, which is a forbidden love chivalry challenge, right? So like he's fallen in love with Guinevere. He's best friends with the king. The king marries Guinevere. And so now he's in love with his best friend's wife and the king's wife. And he can't do anything about it because that would, damage the entire kingdom. And so he makes himself her champion and fights all of her battles for her and sort of loves her without giving into that love for a long, long time. And that's one of the stories of the Knights of the Round Table that's so famous, Lancelot and Guinevere. Gawain, or Gawain, depending on how you pronounce it, Gawain is a traditional English pronunciation, is one of the Knights of the Round Table, the nephew of King Arthur. He's the center of our story. In a lot of English stories, he's the best knight. In a lot of French stories, Lancelot is because he's French. Galahad is Sir Lancelot's son. He marries a woman named Elaine, and they have a son named Galahad. He goes on a Grail quest. He's probably the most pure knight that's ever been born. And then Mordred and Morgana Le Fay, or Morgan Le Fay. You probably know Morgan Le Fay from the Magic Treehouse series. She's good in that. She's evil in all the King Arthur stories. Basically, King Arthur was born, remember, to Igraine when Uther transformed into her husband and impregnated her. Well, she already had 3 daughters, and these 3 daughters are sort of like the 3 fates, but the evilest one is Morgana, and she hates Arthur because he ruined her father was killed and her kingdom was destroyed, and she lost the affection of her mother, who became more affectionate to Arthur than to any of the 3 daughters. And so she hates Arthur, and she becomes a witch. And she's like the most powerful witch in all of England. And she is a counterpoint to Merlin, and does all of these spells and all of these things to sort of damage Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. And the most damaging thing she ever does is basically one-ups Arthur in the same way that his dad did to her mom. She casts a spell that transforms one of her sisters into a beautiful young woman, and she seduces Arthur, and the 2 of them sleep together. This is incest, right? Like he's sleeping with his half-sister. But whatever. They have a child. This child's name is Mordred, and so he becomes sort of the heir to the throne because Arthur and Guinevere never have kids. And so Mordred is the closest thing to the heir to the throne there is, but he's sort of like an incest baby, and he's evil. He is the bad guy of all the stories. He's power hungry. He listens to his aunt more than to his father, but he becomes a Knight of the Round Table. And so how does this all, there's tons of stories. If you want to read them, the original is called Les Morts d'Arthur, which in French is the Death of Arthur, written by a guy named Sir Thomas Malory, who wrote it while he was in jail. And it's a famous work, and you can go read it and learn about it. But I'm not going to tell you all the stories, and it's a very difficult work to read because it's like a plate of spaghetti. There's like 1,000 different noodles, and they all overlap each other. So different stories intersect with different stories, and there's no real linear consistency to any of it. It doesn't follow a plot line from point A to point B. It's just sort of all over the place. And there's 2 noodles sticking out either side. One is the birth of Arthur, and the other is the death of Arthur. And that's what they call sort of the plot structure of it. But it's certainly an interesting read, and the death of Arthur is worth knowing. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight takes place before any of the death of Arthur things happen. But the death of Arthur sort of is precipitated by Lancelot and Guinevere and Mordred. Essentially what happens is this. Lancelot and Guinevere can't handle not being together. She's in love with him. He's in love with her. She's married. They've resisted for years and years. Arthur is getting old at this point, and Lancelot and Guinevere hook up. They have this hookup. Of course, Mordred and Morgan Le Fay have found out about it, and so Mordred outs Lancelot and Guinevere in the middle of their hookup, right? And Lancelot fights his way out and escapes, and Guinevere is captured. And so Guinevere is going to be punished. Theoretically, the punishment she should get is burning at the stake. And so they set up a stake, and they get everything ready to punish her. And Arthur is sort of crushed. Oh, by the way, Morgan Le Fay got rid of Merlin before this. It's a complicated situation, but Merlin was really old at the beginning of all of this, and he has disappeared at this point, so he can't help. But Arthur is crushed. Like his greatest warrior is now gone, and his wife has betrayed him, and he has to burn her at the stake. And so he's going through like this mental breakdown, and like they're getting ready to burn her at the stake when Lancelot, like a good hero, shows up in his armor, cuts his way through Arthur's knights who aren't armed and they were there for a burning, not for a battle, rescues Guinevere and escapes with her. He flees to France. The downside is that while he was cutting his way in to free Guinevere, he killed a bunch of knights, and he killed both of Gawain's brothers, Agravain and Gaheris. And Gawain vows revenge on Lancelot. And so Arthur, to defend his claim to the throne in his kingdom, he forms an army and he sails over to France and he lays siege to Benwick, which is Lancelot's castle, where Guinevere and Lancelot are living. It's very much like Troy in some ways. And every day, Lancelot and Gawain have a fight, and Gawain's wearing this magic belt that makes his strength increase until noon, and then it decreases until sunset. And so they fight, and Gawain almost kills Lancelot every day at noon. And then, by sunset, Lancelot's almost killing Gawain, and then, it goes back and forth. But the key to this whole thing is that when Arthur left England, he put Mordred in charge. And while Arthur's fighting against Lancelot in France, Mordred rebels and takes control of England. And so Arthur is forced to turn his army around, march back to England, and fight his own son, Mordred. And so they have this epic battle in England in which all of King Arthur's knights, except for Sir Bedivere, die. King Arthur himself dies, Mordred dies, and everybody is pretty much slain. And as King Arthur is dying, a boat sails up with 3 women on them that are the 3 half-sisters of him, or the Fates, or something, and they put him on this boat and they sail away to a place called Avalon, where theoretically he's sleeping and he's going to come back and save England when it's in trouble sometime in the future. And that's the situation. Bedivere throws Excalibur into the sea. It takes him 3 tries, to get up the will to do it. But he does it, and then he goes and lives in a monastery, and he's the last of the knights to survive. Aside from the ones who are out on a Grail quest, Galahad and Percival and Bors, they, it's never really told what happens to them and if they get back or not. But if you're interested in Grail quests, go watch Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail, and it connects to all of those as well. So anyway, that's the King Arthur story, and this story is set towards the end of that, but not, Guinevere has not betrayed the king yet with Lancelot. And the king is getting old, and Sir Gawain is very young and just starting out in his knighthood, but he's a nephew, so he is, the king would be like, I don't know, 50 or 55, and Gawain would be like 20. And so you've got this discrepancy in age. So anyway, I'm gonna stop there and leave it, and we'll pick up with the story, the first part, next time. Thanks.